Um, and yeah, so as folks, I guess they're trickling in now. Welcome. We'll get started in just a moment. Oh, and Tyler, Logan, and Mike, the webinar is being recorded. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Sorry to ask, sort of last second. I just actually kind of realized it as I see the green light blinking on my computer. Okay. So I mean, folks are still trickling in, so we'll just give people maybe just another minute. But all of you who have joined us tonight, we're thrilled to have you. Hopefully, some of you were able to join us on Monday night for the first of these two panels. Um, if this panel is even half as incredible as the Monday night one, we're in great shape, and I know it will be, just from our brief conversation with our three panelists so far. Um, and Cameron, just a warning, I'm going to introduce myself and I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, and then we'll kind of go from there. So,
fair enough.
all right. Well, in the interest of time and respecting everyone's time, I think we'll go ahead and we'll get started. Just gonna shift. Here we go. Sorry, move some of these screens around. Okay, so I'm Tom Mold. I am the one of the two moderators this evening. I'm a professor of folklore and anthropology here at Butler University in the Department of History, Anthropology, and Classics. I'm also the director of the Task Force for Indigenous Inclusion and Engagement. And Cameron?
Hi, everyone. I am a fourth year finance major with an anthropology minor. I met Tom my sophomore year, and we have done a lot of work together on the task force.
So it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our three panelists tonight as well. Tyler Buck, Logan York, and Mike Ing. We'll give them full introductions in just a moment, but the way we're going to start the evening is by framing the event with some introductory remarks. I did want to just mention that on Monday night, just as a kind of how we're connecting the two evenings, we were focused a bit more broadly on the world and focused on sort of North America and Oceania. We heard from three incredible speakers. One was Dr. Ku Kahakalau, a Native Hawaiian scholar and activist working in education and cultural preservation. The second was Stephanie Bad Soldier Snow of the Meskwaki Ho-Chunk, working on food sovereignty. And Marina Anderson, who is Haida and Tlingit and working on climate change, habitat restoration, and environmental justice. Tonight, we bring the conversation a bit closer to home. All of our panelists this evening are living and working in Indiana or the broader Midwest, even though their native communities may be farther away. And we're really excited to continue the conversation tonight to consider both the impact of Indigenous activism in our own communities, as well as how to partner in this important work for those of you who are Indigenous and for those of you who are not, but want to serve as allies in this important work. We want to start the evening with a brief land acknowledgement. Many of you who are viewing this right now are at Butler University. This Butler University sits on the traditional homelands of Indigenous peoples who were forcibly removed from this place. These peoples include the Miamiaki, the Lenape, the Potawatomi, the Sawanwa, the Kickapoo, and the Puaria peoples. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Indigenous peoples, past and present, who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This acknowledgement calls us to commit to hearing and engaging Indigenous voices and perspectives and to being better stewards of the land we inhabit. But also, importantly, it calls us to action.
We cannot overemphasize the importance of moving beyond simply words and acknowledgments that can often seem or be merely performative in nature. So tonight's panels are a part of our effort here at Butler to do more than just offer words and wishes. On the screen are some QR codes for resources that you might find helpful. No worry to be in a rush. We will show these again at the end of the presentation. So tonight, we'll begin with Tom and I giving a brief overview with some context and introducing some specific issues we'd like to highlight. Next, the panelists will share their stories and responses to any questions that you put into the Q&A chat bot. Finally, we will share those resources we just showed you and present the BCR code for all Butler students who are interested.
So while there is no single agreed upon definition for Indigenous peoples, the term generally refers to original inhabitants of a land. The estimate is broad, but there are anywhere from 250 to 600 million Indigenous peoples in the world, making up between 3 to 7% of the population today, with over 5,000 distinct nations or tribes. Most Indigenous peoples prefer to be identified according to their national or tribal affiliation, such as Ojibwe, Kanaka, Hawaii, or Miami. There are times, however, when an umbrella term is useful, and on the screen you'll see some of the most common terms in the United States and in Canada. The meanings and connotations of each of these terms has shifted over the years. I know a lot of people, when they ask me about the work that I do, have this question of sort of, what is the appropriate term to use for this kind of broader ethnic group? And it's a shifting target. Ethnonyms, which is the term for an ethnic group, fall in and out of favor. Some are popular with some groups, others with other groups. Generally, Native American and American Indian have been fairly common among the lower 48 states for the past few years, though there's been an increase in using Native peoples as a more common ethnonym for the larger group. Native Alaskan and Native Hawaiian, of course, also common for Indigenous peoples in those two states. First Nations is a formal designation used in Canada for the peoples there, except for the Métis and the Inuit. So people will speak of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. The best practice, of course, is to listen to what terms Indigenous people use for themselves, and also ask people what they prefer to use, as there are some terms used within communities among Indigenous peoples that are not necessarily appropriate for non-Native peoples to use. So one of the most enduring stereotypes about Native peoples in the US has been that they are dying out. And so we start with this question, true or false? There are more Native peoples in the US today than in 1492 at the start of European colonial enterprise. The answer is true, but let's take a look at the numbers. So in 1492, there were between 5 and 12 million Native peoples in the United States. You can see the start of those three lines, dark red, sort of an orange and a yellow. By 1900, there were only 250,000. So that's around a 95% loss in population. Devastating to say the least. But by 2020, there were 9.7 million, an almost 4,000% gain since 1900. Of course, there's a lot of history packed in between those years, not least of which the impact of disease, war, and outright genocide as European colonial powers and then the US government attempted a variety of efforts to eradicate Native peoples from this land physically and culturally. The fact that Native peoples have not only survived this incessant onslaught, but thrived, is one of the reasons we're here tonight, to consider what Indigenous activism can teach us about how to fight against an unjust government, as well as against the all too human social ills that communities face around the world, but also right here in Indiana and in the Midwest. Now, although there are no federally recognized Native nations or tribes in Indiana, there are a significant number of Native peoples living here. At Butler, as you can see, those numbers are fairly small. About 13 students currently enrolled at Butler identify as Indigenous, only one faculty or staff member, 168 graduates since 1925, so about 2 a year. Of course, now that we have 13, that means the numbers are going up, so that's an incredibly positive sign. But the non-completion rate at 29% is one of the highest of any groups. So we still have a long way to go at Butler to make sure that all of our students have access and the support they need to be successful at Butler. Within Indiana, the numbers, of course, a little higher at almost 1%, but that's still below the almost 3%, which is the national average. So for a state that has Indian in its name, it's ironic to say the least that we do not have a larger Native population here. What's also depressing, I think, a bit in terms of the effectiveness of the removal efforts that began in 1830 and it continued throughout the 20th century, is that only one of the top 5 tribes that are represented today in terms of the Native population is from a community that Indiana was their ancestral homeland, and that is the Miami. And so we're thrilled that Logan York could be here tonight with us to speak as a member of the Miami Nation. Of course, also thrilled to have both Tyler Buck and Mike Ing here as well to speak about their experiences as Native in the Midwest and in Indiana.
So to shift our focus away from kind of a very focused look at Indigenous people here in the U.S., let me first begin by saying that it would be impossible to list all groups united by their experiences and responses to systematic oppression, especially colonialism. But tonight we would like to showcase our global perspective by highlighting a few and discussing some of their connections to Indigenous groups. Specifically, we would like to highlight the experiences of African Americans, Indigenous Hawaiians, and the Irish, as well as Australian Aboriginal peoples. Now, Australian Aboriginal peoples, Native Americans in the US, the Irish in Europe, Indigenous and Latin people, if I have that right, in colonial Latin America, and Indigenous Hawaiians have all faced similar brutal policies of exclusion and even extermination. So to take a deeper look at the special connection between the Irish and the Choctaw that some of you might not be aware of. In the 1840s, the Choctaw donated about $5,000, which would be just shy of around $200,000 today, to the Irish shortly after experiencing the Trail of Tears themselves, which you may have heard of, because they emphasized with Ireland's struggles with the potato famine, which was occurring during the similar period. Irish politicians have frequently visited the Choctaw Nation's headquarters, and Ireland recently commemorated this gift in 2017 with a statue titled Kinred Spirits. Now, we are very grateful for the Hub collaborating with us to hold this event tonight. So we would also like to take a special moment to discuss how some groups of Black, Native, Black, and Indigenous people have been affected specifically. Taking a look at the Cherokee tribe, which was considered one of the 5 civilized tribes in early American history for their adoption of European culture, and also overcame the brutal Trail of Tears. In 1866, they signed a treaty to grant freedmen or descendants of Cherokee-owned slaves tribal membership and benefits. However, in 2007, the Cherokee voted to limit tribal membership to only those with proof of Indigenous heritage, which obviously sparked controversies over issues of marginalization and inequality. This move showcases how systematic oppression can build on itself and further isolate some individuals in society, especially those with shared Black and Indigenous heritage, even in modern times. In contrast, the Seminole tribe had allowed Black individuals to join their tribe from about the 17th century to the 19th century. At the time, I believe the majority was Spanish held in Florida. The Black Seminoles ended up being incorporated into the tribal nation from groups who had escaped colonial life or never been born into it. And in the 19th century, both groups overcame forced relocation to modern-day Oklahoma or Indian Territory. However, a small group of Seminole peoples never left Florida, but they were eventually forced onto one of 6 reservations. The Seminole tribe's history is only one example of Black and Indigenous peoples collaborating to fight against colonialism and systematic violence. However, we also think it's important to note that in 2000, the Seminole tribe, similar to the Cherokee, voted to restrict membership to only those with proof of Indigenous ancestry before it was ruled unlawful by the District of Columbia. A much more positive example of Black and Indigenous groups uniting in response to systematic violence is the city of Palmares in 17th century Brazil. This was a settlement composed of Black, Indigenous, and even European individuals who had either escaped colonial life or never experienced it as they were born within the settlement. Its inhabitants, once united, were able to defend against 6 attacks from Portuguese colonists and numbered in the tens of thousands. Colombos, or similar settlements, were actually very common in colonial Latin America, and the sacrifices and victories of their inhabitants still inspire hope against systematic oppression today. In summary, many Indigenous histories have been misrepresented or underrepresented in Western media and institutions, which inspires us to take a look at both contemporary and historical experiences of Indigenous people tonight. I would like to introduce Tyler Buck, a member of the St. Croix Chippewa Indians of Wisconsin. He is an entrepreneur committed to cultural revitalization and promoting sobriety within the community. He also serves as owner and CEO of Recovery Foam LLC and co-owns Auntie and Uncle Snack Shack. In addition to this, Tyler is heavily involved in community initiatives focused on cultural revitalization and Indigenous support. He is also associated with the Sober Squad, which is a group that promotes sobriety and cultural revitalization. His involvement in this group underscores his commitment to supporting and uplifting his community through cultural preservation and sobriety initiatives. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mike Ing, who earned his PhD from Harvard University in 2011, somewhat recent, sorry guys, and has since been a professor in Indiana University's Department of Religious Studies. He writes about the knowledge of his ancestors, who are Hawaiian and Chinese. And his current project is indigenizing the discipline of philosophy by developing the subfield of Hawaiian philosophy. Michael is also the director of Indiana University's Native American and Indigenous Studies program, making him a very significant individual to be here with us tonight. Thank you, Michael.
And last but not least, Logan York is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, or TIPO, for the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma and a citizen of the tribe. He has a bachelor's degree in anthropology from Miami University with minors in history and archaeology. Logan serves as a representative on the Ohio Historic Preservation Advisory Board and over a dozen other boards and leadership teams. Logan came to work for the tribe in April of 2022 after previously working for Rebecca Hawkins, the consulting archaeologist for the Miami tribe. As TIPO, he is part of the Cultural Resources Office team in the Miami tribe's ancestral homeland. So we are thrilled to welcome these 3 panelists who are going to share some of the insights that they have had from their own work. And we're going to start actually with that as our first question, which is, could you each describe the work that you are engaged in and the impact that you're having within your communities? And we'll just, for this first question, we'll just go alphabetical. So we'll ask Tyler if you'll go first, and then Mike, and then Logan.
Can you hear me? So, well, my name is Tyler Buck, and I'm a member of the St. Croix Chippewa Indians. I guess some of the work that I'm doing and focused on in my community is advocating for sobriety and trying to help my people recover. It seems like drugs and alcohol is a big part, plays a big role in our communities, right? And it's kind of sad, when you think about it, because it's killing a lot of our people at a fast rate. And so some of the things I'm doing is, I try to help individuals, with work, or help them with any type of support, or link them with people to get the help they need, whether it be like treatment or meetings or whatever it is, even if they just need an ear. I'm here, you know.
Thank you so much, Tyler. Mike?
Uh, Hello, Mike Kako. So, first, let me express my mahalo, my appreciation to Tom and Julie for creating this space here to talk about these issues here today. For the sake of time, I'll just kind of jump right into things here. So, my area of work, of course, is with higher education. As mentioned, I'm a professor at Indiana University down in Bloomington, and so much of what I've been involved in is community building within the university. And it should first be said, I think, that the university is, of course, somewhat of a colonial space. And so a lot of our work involves trying to think about how decolonizing that space is possible, or perhaps more positively said, how we might indigenize that space within the university. Um, I fully respect Native peoples that decide that the university is not for them and decide to simply build their communities in other areas. But for the Native peoples that do want to engage the university, this is kind of what I've spent the last 14 or so years, at least, of my time doing here at Indiana University. We've been fairly successful in persuading the university in the need to grow the number of not only Native students that are there, but the number of Native faculty members. So we just instituted this first year a scholarship, for instance, that covers at least tuition plus a few other expenses for all federally recognized tribal members that meet kind of a financial aid threshold. As soon as they kind of meet that threshold, everything kicks in and tuition and things are provided for them. That came, of course, with a lot of work from others before us. But these are the kinds of initiatives, at least, that we've been trying to build. Constant pressure, you learn about the kinds of work that's needed in order for institutions to dedicate funds, right? And so it's a constant pressure of people that have been doing this kind of stuff for decades to lean on them in various kinds of ways, sometimes very positively in terms of building relationships, sometimes less positively by pointing out the fact, as I've done on numerous occasions, that there are unfortunately more dead Native Americans than living ones on the campus of Bloomington, just because of the sheer number of Native American remains that are held here on our campus. And so other things like being able to repatriate those remains are a thing of also kind of constant pressure that we work with at the university as well. We also try to increase the number of faculty members. We were able to make at least 3 offers to Native American faculty members over the past 2 years. One successfully came. We're working on kind of recruiting a couple of more. Things are, of course, much more complicated within the state and federal level, and that I imagine will be kind of a continued point of discussion. But those are at least the kinds of things that we've been working on within the institution of the university.
Thank you so much, Mike. Logan?
Yeah. So I'll also kind of speed along because I could talk about this for about 45 minutes. So I kind of have 2 different portions of what I do. The first one is I deal with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Essentially, what that means is any project that happens on federal land or has any federal money in it that involves ground disturbance. They basically need to consult with tribes that have historical or cultural interest in an area. So that means any road projects, any buildings, any signs, anything that you think potentially could be 106 probably is, and way more than that. So we get about 4,000 of those projects a year, 4,000 new projects a year, and we still consult on old ones. So that takes up quite a bit of time. Normally, those things require, 100-ish pages of review, depending on the project. And then on the other side of things, and I should say I'm reviewing those for historic resources. So I'm basically trying to make sure that we don't have any archaeological sites, cultural sites, or sacred sites within a given area to make sure that that project isn't going to affect or disturb them. And if it is, basically how to mitigate that with the stakeholder who's performing the project. And then when I have free time from all that, what I do is a lot of public education. That can be at universities, it can be at conferences, it can be at schools. So I do a lot of public presentations. I also deal with a lot of curriculum. So I do help sometimes with school curriculums. I just got off of a board or a leadership team, I should say, in Illinois, working on a state curriculum for the state of Illinois, and we finished that, and it was really successful. So that was a lot of fun. We did a lot of good work there. I also work with a lot of the parks, city, state, and national parks and forests, whether that is signage or preservation of archaeological sites or even ecology sites, depending on the specific project. So basically, anything that has to do with Miami people, I probably have a hand in it somewhere or another.
Wonderful.
Here in the homeland.
Work, Logan.
Thank you so much, Logan. Across all three, I'm hearing just a couple of things as we think about kind of the shared challenges, and before we maybe get to some of the strategies, but representation, I'm hearing come up. Of course, the kind of interpersonal, but also personal and kind of larger issues facing people, whether at home or in institutions. As Mike kind of described, people transitioning perhaps from whether reservation land, but just into colonial spaces like the university. And so I'd love to hear, and then it's just sovereignty issues that Logan talked about, that Mike talked about. I wonder if the three of you might comment a bit on both the specific kinds of challenges that you think you're facing right now because of kind of being indigenous, of the kind of positionality of indigeneity, and then perhaps how some of those challenges may intersect with other groups, whether other marginalized groups, other ethnic groups, et cetera. So if you might talk just a little bit about the kind of the pressing challenges of the work that you're doing in any order at all.
Well, I can go first. So I think the most pressing things that I deal with right now is a lot of miseducation. So I deal with a lot of external issues rather than internal issues, though the things that I do externally do have ramifications for us internally. So the fact that we're still here, that's a really big one. I did have one minor correction actually on the beginning slides, is we actually do have trust land within the state of Indiana. So we do have legal jurisdiction within the state of Indiana. So that's new though. That's quite new. Only a couple months old, not even a year. So we do have that now. And just educating people who we are today, our actual past, where the government is today, has led to a lot of opportunities for citizens. And then just, stopping a lot of miseducation, stopping stereotypes that we didn't live in teepees, we drive cars today. Just because we don't live like it's 1795 doesn't mean it makes us any less Miami or any less Ojibwe or any less whatever tribe that particular person is, that we are a constantly changing people just like every other people on earth. So I think for me, it is that education side of things that I deal with mostly, because the bar is very, very low. Everywhere that I've been, it's been quite low. If I'm not actively engaging with a Native community, then that level of education around Native peoples is always not good. Beyond that, on the other side of things, protecting archaeological sites is a big thing for us. So trying to prevent the disturbance of sacred sites, but most importantly, ancestors, making sure that a new building or a new road isn't going to be disturbing ancestors, digging our graves back up again. I specifically do not deal with NAGPRA. In theory, I should say, in theory, I should not be dealing with NAGPRA. So I do not participate in the repatriation of our ancestors. Sometimes I do anyway, but that is not as Thippo. That is a relatively knowledgeable person who can be trusted. And I'll do it kind of under that guise rather than in my official position here. That's about as short as I can make that. So I'll let the other twos go.
All right, well, I guess I can go. Can you hear me? So I guess, there's a lot of issues, that I deal with myself and our communities. A lot of it is, the drugs and trying to get people the help, and then trying to get them, like into a safe place where they can get clean, where they can get sober, and then try to build that foundation and then go from there. I believe that, in order to try to get clean, I believe that, we got to bring our cultural and our religion back into our ways. I feel like our young ones are losing our ways, like our ceremonies, like a lot of people, like in my community, don't show up to our ceremonies. We got people from like Mille Lacs, or from, let's say they come from Fond du Lac. They come and they help us put on our ceremonies, because we got people in our people in our own community that live right down the street, right? And they don't even come to our ceremonies. It's like we're losing it, and we're losing our language, and it's such a struggle, because I mean, I don't know my language, but I mean, I go to ceremonies and I try to learn and I try to help out when I can and do what I can. And I feel like that's some of the things that I'm trying to work on, and that I'm struggling with, is to get people more involved in the ceremony aspect. I mean, because that's what it got me clean and sober, you know.
Thank you,
Yes,
Tyler. It's really great to hear.
um, I think my biggest challenge can probably be put under the label of invisibility, and then maybe discussed in a couple of different dimensions. Very similar, I think, to Logan's experience, right? Indigenous peoples, for the most part, throughout at least the areas of Indiana that I'm familiar with, um, are pretty invisible. And even the kind of education that most students, at least that come through my classroom, receive in high school, for instance, is very, very minimal. And so they, for the most part, don't know the names of the native peoples that have lived in Indiana, or the lands that they grew up in, and will sometimes say innocently ignorant things. My wife and our children are members of the Navajo Nation, for instance, and they've been told more than once, after hearing, right, that they were Native American, "Wow, are you like pure Native American?" And my wife will say, "Yeah, I guess so." And they'll say, "Wow, I didn't think there were any of those left." And so those kinds, we might put them in areas of microaggression or something like this, right? Or I'll put them in the area of a kind of innocent ignorance, right? That um, people just don't know what they don't know. And helping non-native people kind of get through that um, takes a certain amount of resources, right? And a certain amount of willingness, I think, from native peoples, which may be more willingness than can actually be demanded from many of them, right? And so there's a kind of education fatigue, I think, that sets in for a lot of native peoples in constantly having to explain certain kinds of things. There's also, of course, a much more pernicious ignorance, a kind of willful ignorance, I think, that exists within Some people, at least within Indiana, and this isn't unique, of course, to Indiana, and some of these people, unfortunately, sit in positions of power and make decisions that impact Native peoples or that impact the ability of non-Native peoples to learn about Native peoples. And sometimes these pockets of willful ignorance are kind of issues of motivation masquerading as a lack of resources or as a resource problem. In other words, um, there will be some, let's say, some folks in positions of power that will explain that there are limited resources available to learning about Native communities, supporting Native communities, attracting more Native peoples to come, etc. Although when you continue the conversation with them, it becomes quite clear that it's more of a motivational problem than it is an actual resource problem, right? They're actually not motivated to help or to support Native peoples in ways that Native peoples find it meaningful. Within Native communities, at least again, the Native communities that I'm familiar with that frequent Indiana University, there's also a kind of issue of invisibility even among Native peoples, not just, of course, to non-Native peoples, right? But even within Native peoples, the struggles perhaps that Tyler's alluding to, that you have peoples that have been raised oftentimes away from their tribal communities, and they come now to university having graduated from high school. And this is a period of exploration for a lot of people. And I think a lot of these young folks are interested in learning more about their Native heritage. And so trying to create a certain degree of community for those students to be able to do that can also be incredibly challenging. First of all, because of the vast diversity as far as Native peoples are concerned, right? And so you have peoples that may be members of the, Navajo Nation, Citizen Band Potawatomi, et cetera, that are all coming together that have very, very different kind of cultural backgrounds. And, we're challenged with trying to build some kind of cohesive Native community, of course, among those peoples. Of course, Logan's colleagues at Miami University at the Miami Center there, of course, have been at this kind of thing for far longer than we have, and have achieved, I would say, a certain degree of success, and so certainly something to be emulated there. Anyway, so I'll stop there, but yeah, the challenges fall under this broader category, I'd say, of invisibility.
Thank you. Definitely picked on some shared themes between all three of you. And I thought it was really important you pointed out kind of, it's not just about getting people to be aware of like histories, groups, and cultures. It's also being able to see Indigenous peoples, no matter where they're from, as just another group of people that can be different, that can change. So thank you for touching on that. But moving on, what would any of you say have been the most effective strategies, and how have you kind of measured or considered that benefit?
I guess I'll go. I guess. So I guess, in my line of work, I guess, I mean, kind of a lot of effective strategies, right? As people get pulled away from their community, right? And it's not by choice, right? It's by legal issues, that take them out of the community, and they put them, they put them in the county jail, or they put them in treatments. Sometimes they're forced, like myself, like I was, I was, like I was on a crash course to nowhere, and I was looking at a lot of jail time, and I ended up going to jail, and I was faced with a lot of time, and it made me really think, man. And I sat down and I prayed, and I prayed and I prayed and I prayed and I asked for help. And then I've been sober since, So I think being pulled away from the community is, like getting people away from their friends and old, you know, family or whatever it is, that's bringing you back, that brings you back constantly, because it's like a cycle of bad habits. Go in, come out, go in, come out, go in, come out. So I mean it's kind of effective, I guess, in a bad way and in a good way.
Thank you, Tyler. Would you, a little follow up, would you say kind of your experience as an entrepreneur and I don't know how to say, like a hard worker, able to kind of make these sacrifices and kind of inform others about the bad things that can happen from bad decisions?
Well, I guess as being an entrepreneur, right? I guess I always had that drive, right? Because before I got clean and sober, like I was living, I was in the streets and I was selling drugs and I was doing a lot of bad things, right? But I always, had money to do what I had to do. I always had to get money to live and to live that lifestyle I was living. You gotta have money. So it was always go, 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 right? Get the money, get the money, get the money. So now I kind of changed it around, right? So now, I started the Aunties and Uncles Snack Shack, right? And that's a food truck, and that picked up, and that is a really booming thing, in Indian country, Ojibwe country up here. And then now last May, I started Recovery Foam, and it's a spray foam insulation company, and that is starting to really pick up. So I think you just got to have that drive, man, and that goal. And it seems like a lot, like a lot of addicts, right? Like a lot of drug addicts, have that drive, right? They just got to find it and go and make it happen, right? Because if you can, if you can hustle $200 a day to go get a bag to get high, you can come out here and hustle to for your job or for work or whatever it may be, So I mean, a lot of people have that drive.
Thank you, Tyler.
I think one of the strategies, at least that I've employed, and I'm not sure this is the most effective of strategies, is to I think it is, right. You assume the best of people. I think in some regards, right, until proven otherwise. And so I try to assume that at least the non-native people that I interact with are innocently ignorant rather than willful ignorant. And in the process of education, encouraging them to take the initiative in that process, right? And so it's not simply relying upon, I don't mind, providing readings and these kinds of things, right? We have a First Nation Center, which is a cultural center on campus, which is dedicated as a space to kind of build community for Native American students and faculty. And so, if people are willing to actually come over to the center, right, that's a small move for them to make to come into our space, rather than simply just wanting kind of information dumped at them via email and those kinds of things, right? And so, small ways, I think, of getting people to take some kind of initiative and put in the work to really think about what it means to build relationships with Native peoples. As far as working strategies, working with Native students are concerned, sometimes there's a certain degree of shame, I think, embedded over generations of Native students. Native students come in and maybe implicitly taught for a whole host of reasons that they should be ashamed to be Native. Or perhaps they've again been raised away from their people, don't speak the language, don't do the ceremonies, and so they're ashamed that way as well. And so one of the strategies that we try to use is to, doing small things to encourage students to embrace their Native identity, to try it on, right? And to not fear making mistakes in trying to speak the language or trying to learn about their people or talking about it, right? And there's a way, I think, in which way in which many Native peoples, I think, are kind of naturally humble, right? And so they're not going to assume a kind of knowledge about their culture if they don't really have it. But encouraging them to see themselves, right, as a Native person, right? It takes a lot of work, and there's a lot of psychological baggage perhaps that kind of comes along with that. And of course, not. But I'm trained to think about old traditions and things like this, right? I mean, I do really kind of classic philosophy, kind of worldview stuff, right? So thinking about how to engage or re-engage an identity that has been suppressed for generations, that's not something, right? That maybe it's something I've been through personally myself, but it's not something I've spent a lot of time trying to learn how to do. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I would say is over the course of doing all the education stuff that I have, the thing that I see that gets results really is that relationship building through education. So I get reached out to by dozens of organizations, brand new organizations over the years, and hundreds of ones that we started building relationships with, and then we get the opportunities to tell our own story, like places like this. So this is a relatively new relationship. We have not worked together for very long, but it is through education that opportunities like this have become more and more common. Not just for me to talk about our history, but for other Mi'kmaq people to highlight other aspects of our culture. So oftentimes I will speak somewhere about our history because history is my thing. I do, I have an archaeology background. I find it cool, but not everyone does. So we will have artists who do ribbon work or cattail sewing or pottery or metalsmithing or any kind of art or dances or songs or that will go do these things to highlight them for other groups. And I kind of gauge my success on how many new groups are starting to reach out to us, whether it's to me, my deputy, or another member of our Cultural Resources Office. And especially how many of those new groups are reaching back out again after that initial talk. So we don't like to see, one big grand gesture right at the beginning, and then that goes away. We like to see a sustainable relationship for both us and the group that we're working with. And things like this, or more singular presentations have been the most successful I've found in starting to build those relationships. But beyond that, just building the relationship, we have to become friends if it's going to continue to work, is what we found. That's been the most successful. So the fact that, Miami University, that started from a friendship between Chief Olds and the head of the sports department at Miami University. If they had not gotten along on that first trip, nothing would have happened. But because that worked, it works and it continues to work. And our chief is still friends with the president of the university there. I'm good friends with, members of the Nature Conservancy, or I could list a whole bunch of different groups that we work with. And that's what's been most successful, is building up those relationships through education and just through talking.
I got it, Logan. It seems like sometimes the simplest way can be the best. Thank you for that.
I do try and keep it simple. There's no for me it works. It works.
Sounds good. So next question for, I guess, anyone. There's no real order. What is the most distinct aspect of the challenges faced today by Indigenous groups, both around you and around the world, from what you've taken in during your time?
I really think that's a really hard question to answer, because we're all so different. I mean, even amongst the United States, there's 574 federally recognized tribes, each with our own language and culture. So it's really hard to say, oh, because we deal with a lack of education, being removed from our homelands. That's not necessarily the case for all other tribes, even within the Eastern Woodlands. So, you know, a lot of the Anishinaabe groups, the Potawatomi tribes, some of them are still back within their original homelands, the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk. Their land base is obviously much smaller, so the issues they're going to face is going to be different from ours. You know, chronic economic bracket problems that you find are going to, you know, be prevalent within a lot of Native communities. Alcohol and drug addictions are a problem for us down in Miami, Oklahoma, the same as a lot of the other Native communities around us. And a lack of education within the community. So be that traditional education, whether they are close to our ceremonies, close to our language, but beyond that, just further education in general. Not just of who we are as Miami people, but getting people to complete high school or even go beyond that. That's another issue that we face. But I don't want to say that just because that's the issues we face, that the same issues are going to be faced in Oceania or even amongst Potawatomi up north.
Thanks, Logan.
I guess some of the challenges we face up here, you know, in Wisconsin is, you know, getting our some of our members employed and keeping them employed, right? Like you know, I mean a lot of it falls back on like generational trauma and just things like I don't know, it's hard to get some members to build them a work ethic and get out of that bubble that they've been living in. You know, like we're in such a small community. You know, it's like a world within the world. You know, it's like I don't know. We struggle with a lot of things for sure, and definitely our ceremonies. You know, and keeping our treaty rights alive is something that we try to strive and push for. You know, like me and my family, my brothers. That's something that we struggle with. A lot of people don't wanna exercise their treaty rights. I'm not sure why, but you know, I mean, I love it. We love it. You know, it's something we look forward to every year. You know, it's coming up here pretty soon, the spring, as soon as the
You
ice come
want
off
to
the lakes.
expand on the treaty rights, just to give everyone a little context.
So I guess the treaty rights. So like, you know, so our tribe, you know, we go spearing, we harvest fish in the spring and then in the fall. And then, you know, there's so many lakes we can do that's within our ceded territory. So, you know, we get a group of guys and a few boats and we go out and we get fish for our families, we get fish for elders that can no longer go harvest and you know, sometimes some elders will come out with us and they'll sit on the boat landings and wait for us to come in and sometimes they'll go out on a boat with us and you know, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of hard work, but it's fun, man. It's really rewarding. You know, when you can go to an elder and be like, here's some fish. You know, and when they, you know, like they wait for that. You know, it's like they love it. You know, because it's not every day that you can get fresh walleye off of Lake Mille Lacs. You know, or fresh walleye off of our lakes here. You know, so we clean it and we'll bring it to them and something we strive for. You know, we try to keep it alive and we try to teach our kids and bring our kids with. And we have little groups and classes. You know, like we'll bring kids out and show them. And you know, some like it, some don't. You know, but it's a lot of fun for sure.
Thank you, Tyler.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I can say, you know, anything better that's already been said, right? I mean, I think most Native peoples want what most any peoples want, right? We want the power to shape our lives in meaningful ways. And there are a number of ways in which that has been prohibited, inhibited, And so, you might talk about these as various kinds of sovereignties, right? Political sovereignty. Now we talk about food sovereignty, data sovereignty, all of these other kinds of things. Cultural revitalization, right? Tied into things like language revitalization of ceremonies, and so all of these other kinds of things, right? That are going to be different depending upon the communities and even within the community, depending upon the time and other kinds of contextual factors. Um, the Yeah, and that's more or less in a nutshell. Just for the sake of time, I won't say more.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks so much. I wonder, as sitting here as many of us are at Butler University, I can't help but hear how often you all three spoke of education and the importance of educating both internally in terms of your own people, but externally. And Mike, I was really struck by the term you had of education fatigue, and particularly the outsized burden that often people who are already in marginalized or minority populations have to constantly step forward and do this education over and over and again. So I wonder if there are strategies that any of you might recommend, whether it's for those of us who are in positions where our job is to teach, whether it's students or community members who want to sort of take it upon themselves to learn more. What can that education look like that relieves some of the education fatigue on Indigenous people?
Yeah, so maybe I'll speak this real briefly here, right? This sometimes interactions, right, among people can become transactional, right? Like you have something that I want, and so like, can I have what I want, like from you in this regard? And so this seems to be a particularly kind of resource-centered way of looking at interactions. Um, and at least from many Kanaka Hawaii or Native Hawaiian perspectives, the focus instead tends to be kind of relationally centered, right? Like I'm interested, like, who are you? Where did you come from? What brought you here? Like, what's going on in your life that's led to this moment of you asking me, right? Like to do something for you. And it really is, I think, taking the time to form meaningful relationships that eases the fatigue in some respects, right? So like, I don't mind like coming around and talking with friends. You know what I'm saying? Like I could do that all day, right? Like there's no greater joy than that in some regards, even if my friends have different views than I have, and we can talk through them and work through them. And so that seems to be at least kind of one way that may be helpful, trying to, change the way that we view the reasons for which we're engaging in other kinds of engaging with peoples. There also, I think, a certain degree of being like humbly curious or something like that, I think, right? For people can also be useful as well. And so, you have to, if so, for instance, I know in our case at Indiana University, yeah, I'm a settler there, right? And so I want to form relationships with the peoples that are native to those places. Um, and so there's a way in which, I mean, I'm going to work as hard as I can to try to find resources that's not going to tax them, from my education, right, from my educational process. I've contacted George Ironstack, I think, right, is who runs the Miami Center, and I've asked him like, okay, like I found these things, right? Like, are any of them any good? Should I spend time with them? And those are easy things, right? Like to say yes, no, and things like this too, rather than can you provide me with 20 different things that I can share with folks? Those kinds of things I think have been helpful. My wife and I have joked that we're going to start charging for land recognition openings that we're oftentimes asked to do. Donations made to our First Nation Center, for instance, they start at $100 for the basic land recognition, and then for $500, maybe somebody will actually dress up. Anyway, we're joking, I think, more than anything else in this respect, right? But that's one of the ways I think that we express our kind of educational fatigue.
Thank you.
I would also recommend going on to tribal websites and figuring out what resources they've already put out. So like for us, we've got our governmental website, which has links to our community blog. We call it a community blog. I like to refer to it as an educational hub because it has things from very young people to end of life, post-college, any level of education that you could possibly want. It's got it. We have public-facing ethnobotanical databases. So even little things like that, you don't always have to reach out to us. You can just try and find those resources we've already put out for people, and that can kind of help combat that fatigue. Because yes, I mean, we do get bombarded with questions, requests, talk requests, land acknowledgement requests. We get thousands of them a year. So it's really hard for us to keep up with all of it all the time. And then when you go do it in person, it happens there too. And it's just like this constant steamroll of education. Even if it's something you're passionate about, it can wear you down if you're not careful. Even in the best intentioned groups. So that is one thing that we do like to point out to people is that, when you make this request, know that you are one of thousands of requests coming in just like this.
I think just, educating people, on some of the small things, maybe like a small contemporary powwow or something, or having a couple of maybe, like our head ceremonial men to come in and speak and give you a little demonstration or talk about how we do our ceremonies or what happens. And, even in our schools here, our elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, we have little small yearly powwows, to educate other students in the school, and I think that really helps.
Real quick, somebody in the Q&A actually asked if anyone has any book recommendations. So if you have any material you'd like to recommend.
And one thing we'll do also for all of you out there attending, Cameron and our intern, Alina Ahmad, who is also on this webinar and has been critical in putting all of this together, we'll be putting together a series of resources. So what we'll ask actually Tyler and Mike and Logan to do, if they have those suggestions, to sort of email them to us, and then we'll get those out to everybody who's in attendance. So we'll make sure we get those to you. There is another question in the Q&A, and so this is about the time where we do start shifting over to questions from audiences. So please go ahead and start putting those in. I'm going to get to this question of repatriation in just a second. That's our first question up. But before we leave this conversation about kind of how maybe in particular non-Indigenous people can learn more, do more, and participate in this kind of Indigenous activism, I wonder, I'm hearing relationship building being a kind of a critical piece. Go out and make friends, take honest, sincere, and authentic interest in people. Do the work first of going to the tribal websites and educating yourself. I really appreciated what Mike said is he doesn't just go to George and say, tell me all the things. He says, I've been doing some research. Are these good things? So I just wanted to ask the panelists maybe one last time, sort of if there are any others, maybe specifically thinking about non-Indigenous audience members, education, build relationships, anything else you would encourage folks to be thinking about or doing right now? And then we'll get to those, sorry, and then we'll get to those questions. So please, everybody, if you're listening, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Go ahead and type in your question, and we'll get to them in just a moment. Sorry, thanks.
So there's Anton Troyer. He had wrote some books. So I mean, I think you could really get educated by that if you looked up some books. He's a professor at, I think it's at in University of Minnesota, Bemidji, I believe. So he's really highly educated. He does ceremonies here in my community, comes down, and I think he would be a good one to look up. He is highly intelligent and knows a lot, and he apprenticed under one of our ceremonial men here for a lot of years, and now he took that and he helped revitalize the Ojibwe language, and he had a lot to do with, I'm gonna say maybe the Ojibwe dictionary. So I would look him up for sure.
Yeah, I can provide more book recommendations. I would just like to be able to go back and actually read through some of them. I've got a few that pop off the top of my head, but I'd rather go back and actually give a more in-depth review of books, because there's not a lot of them that I would say are super good. And even when they are good, oftentimes you kind of need to know what you're reading through, because there's going to be little bits of bad sprinkled in. Yeah.
Definitely understand where you're coming from.
And what was that last question, Tom, that you just asked? I answered the previous one and forgot yours.
No, not at all. Not a problem. It was just in addition to sort of educating ourselves, looking for those books and looking at those websites, and seeking to build authentic relationships with Native peoples, our neighbors, etc. Were there any other things that you might recommend, in particular to non-Indigenous sort of allies, if you will, what they can be doing to kind of join in the fight here?
Well, I think one obvious one is, go to Native businesses. So that's a big one. If you see Native-owned businesses, become patrons of them. So I mean that's an easy first start, and help educate yourself. So use those resources that we talked about, even if you're not a teacher, or if you're not planning on educating the masses, you can still go onto tribal resources, websites, community blogs, online dictionaries, things that the tribes have produced or been involved with, and educate yourself. So that's another big one. So I think that will help stem and support the other three. Educating even what a tribe is, because even that basic understanding for people is not great. So just get to this base level and then start working down those other stepping stones, because all of this is just beginnings of things.
Very well said.
Yeah, I think I've more or less said my piece in terms of what could be done. I think, this idea of some degree of being humbly curious, right, can kind of play out in different kinds of ways. Actually, let me just preface all this by saying that I think what non-native peoples can do, especially young non-native peoples, is given our governmental context and the context in which we exist here as a citizen of the United States of America, is that you can vote. That I think would be number one. I mean, we haven't discussed, I think, and nor need we here, at least, we haven't discussed, I think, the ways in which some of these anti-DEI measures may impact Native communities, especially Native communities within particularly red states. So anyway, I'll say that, right? That I think can be a fairly easy thing, I think, to do. But pursuing this idea of being humbly curious, I think a little bit more, right? There are ways in which, in taking some kind of an activist stance, you never want to take the place of Indigenous peoples. At the same time, too, I think it is fine to ask questions like, should we be engaging in this particular kind of activity? And so I had a non-native student in an Indigenous thought class that I taught a little while back, and she came from a smaller town in Indiana that still did like an annual, I don't know if it was Thanksgiving, so I think it was a Thanksgiving thing, where all of the kids in the elementary school dressed up as like pilgrims and Indians or something like this. And so she was like, I don't know if we really should be doing this. But at the same time, like I don't want to take the place of a native person. You know what I'm saying? Like saying that this shouldn't be done. I'm not a native person. What do I do? How do I work through that? And so thinking about kind of what it means to be a good ally in that sense, right? I mean, in this particular case, I think it would be one of starting the conversation, right? Like going back, she's like, I have some connections. It just so happens to be the case. I think it was something like her brother-in-law or something like was the principal of the school, right? Like that seems like a place for a kind of dialogue to begin. Is it possible to invite Native peoples as far as this dialogue is concerned? But I mean, just getting something started and maintaining a certain degree of humility such that you're willing to step aside, right? When Native peoples want to come in and actually have their voices heard. I think that's kind of an important thing. But you know, I mean, we I think need more activists and not less. And so articulating some kind of a voice, I think if it's positioned within a certain degree of humility, I think could be incredibly impactful. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike, I really kind of identify with your comment there. Going into college, my mom she was always very adamant, as in, if no one is speaking, you speak up always. So I think that's a point that can be very overlooked, but definitely very powerful. Our next question, someone asked, the word repatriate has come up a few times in this context. Could you share more about that?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. What we meant in this case is through the National American or Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. Sorry, took me a second there. I was thinking of the NHPA. And effectively, what we're talking about is the return of grave goods, ancestors, and items of cultural patrimony to the tribes that made them, or the likely tribes that made them, or those ancestors were. So when we talk about repatriating ancestral grave goods and people, that's literally what we mean, is giving those people back to the community that they belong in and returning them to the ground where they do belong. If they wanted to be in storage, that's where they would have been put originally, and those are still people who deserve respect. If they they are not consenting to be being dug up 1,000 years later, 500 years later, however long it is, and they're worthy of respect and deserve it. You don't see people digging up, people in cemeteries, but for us, it's something that we encounter relatively often. I still, will go out and visit archaeological sites, and I do still find people digging up graves. That's something that's still very prevalent amongst certain communities here east of the Mississippi, and I'm sure it's a problem out west as well. So that idea of digging up treasures and relics and all of these things sometimes comes at the expense of digging up our graves. So that's something we're actively combating, and that's what we mean when we say repatriate.
Thank you, Logan.
A little more in depth than what just repatriate means, but yes.
As a fellow Native person, I think it's very important that we bring up this kind of equivalence because it can come off a little brash, but in reality, these things are very, very similar, if not considered equal, from a morally kind of ambiguous and neutral stance. So I think it's always good to remind people, like, just because it's older or just because it's non-Western does not mean in any way that it's any lesser.
If I could, as people, I will encourage audience members to continue to send in questions. I would like, if possible, to follow up on your comment, Mike, about the current political situation, especially around issues of DEI and how that is impacting Indigenous communities, both in higher ed and outside of it. And I'd love to hear from any and all of you that would comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I worry about things, a kind, what are they calling it? Patriotic education, I think, right? And things like this that are supposed to be put into the high schools. I think this is incredibly worrisome, not only for Native peoples, of course, right? But that's who we're talking about here today. I mean, my children have, my oldest, at least, who's finishing up high school now, has been told on more than one occasion to, quote, go back to where you came from. Which, is telling in, in a number of respects, right? The degree of education, I think, that already exists, and the way in which certain ideologies may become further entrenched within high school curricula. Where it impacts, I think, things in higher education, it takes some degree of education to help administrators to understand that, at least when we're talking about federally enrolled Native peoples, that this is a political distinction and not an ethnic distinction. And that has helped to do things like preserve the scholarship that I was just talking about, and hopefully to preserve a number of other things. This of course doesn't capture all Native peoples within America. There are many Native peoples who are, of course, not members of federally recognized entities. Native Hawaiians are not a part of the 574 federally recognized groups in the United States, but this at least preserves some aspects of what's needed, I think, for success of Native peoples.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was going to really focus on, is the fact that we are a political designation. We are sovereign nations, the federally recognized tribes, and that political distinction is what protects us as these anti-DEI initiatives are really rolling out. That especially with what I'm doing. Legally speaking, working with tribes is different than working with ethnic groups or racial groups. You're working with a political thing rather than just a group of people, which is not the best of systems, but when it can be used to protect us, we will do that. Because yes, I do think that as these anti-DEI things are going to start rolling out more and more, I think we'll be lumped in with that. But because we can use the laws that are here, I think we can effectively insulate ourselves from it. As much as I wish we didn't have to use those laws to do it. I wish we didn't have to do it at all, but we are where we are.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of kind of a struggle now, with everything that's going on, it kind of hit hard, like within our tribe, people are getting laid off from work and cutting hours, and the political aspect is definitely taking a toll on us in Indian country. It's been rough, and then yesterday I was down at the Capitol in Madison, Wisconsin, and our tribal chairman gave a speech, and on things that we need to work on, and we need to come together as the tribes, all tribes in the state of Wisconsin, and I believe she touched on a lot of things, and um it was really good, to march at the Capitol with all the tribal nations from Wisconsin. I mean, I thought it was a good thing. It was on YouTube Live yesterday, and he gave a really good speech. I think it's something, maybe if you guys get time, look it up. Maybe I can send the link to Cameron, and he can spread the word, and you guys can watch the speech that he gave yesterday.
Oh, I'd love to, Tyler. And for anyone who doesn't know, Tyler and I are in the same tribe, so that is my chairman as well.
Yeah.
So we have a couple more minutes if anybody has any additional questions. But I'd like to actually just offer a moment to our three panelists, to Mike and Tyler and Logan. Are there any kind of maybe concluding statements, things that you were hoping to say tonight that you'd like to convey to this audience, to any of us, as we sort of think about starting to wrap up?
I think for me, I've said pretty much everything I came to say. I think, I want people to reach out to us. I want people to use the resources that we have, that we've produced, that we've made public. Pretty much everything that we've done as a tribe is all publicly available. So I want people to use them respectfully. If you're going to be using them to educate people, then definitely, reach out to us to make sure it's being used correctly. Especially our language, it can be confusing if you didn't grow up with it. So I will often see people who obviously went on the dictionary for things and they're doing it wrong. So, if you're going to be using it to educate anyone beyond yourself, just make sure that you're doing it correctly. But yeah, I want to see engagement. I want to see people reach out to us. I want more presentations, not just from Miami people, but from others. I want to see our voices elevated as much as we possibly can, as much as the public can possibly help us with.
I guess, like I'm always here. I'm always open. If you guys have any questions or whatever, you can reach out. Cameron knows how to get a hold of me. I can definitely try to help educate on some of the things. I'm sorry about that, but my son is banging on his drum right now in my living room. So he likes to sing songs, and he's a little song maker. So, I mean, if you guys need anything, Cameron or whatever, I mean, even if you wanted us to do a video or something on spearing with our treaty rights, I would be glad to make a video and show, what we do, how we do it.
Thank you, Tyler. I'm sure everyone appreciates that, and that's quite an offer to help others.
I think I've said most of what I wanted to say. I think it bears, and I imagine everybody here, it's probably mostly from the Butler community, but assuming that I'm talking to maybe a wider audience than that, for non-native folks in terms of things that I haven't already said. I think and in thinking specifically about higher education, it bears asking what kinds of things is your university doing and ought your university to do for Native peoples. Most universities that have been around for more than 100 years have Native remains on them, right? And they're federally mandated, of course, to make good faith efforts to return those remains, right? What kinds of things are they doing? What kinds of scholarships are available, right, for Native peoples? What are they doing to encourage Native presence, at least on the campus, to kind of build up that community? If there are Native people that are watching this that are thinking of working with or within universities, make the universities work for you. Resources aren't unlimited, but for the most part, I think there are people within many universities that want to do something and are open to the idea of community-driven initiatives. Right. And so universities very much have been and are still, for the most part, are places where, professors have research initiatives and they want to study Native peoples and they extract data from them and use that data in certain kinds of ways. But that is changing. And I think more and more people are open to the idea of a community coming and saying something to the effect of, you know what we want to do? We want to be able to preserve our language through oral interviews done with our elders. And the university could very much help with certainly the cataloging of those things, preserving the data, right? Ensuring, of course, that Native peoples maintain that kind of data sovereignty, right? But there are resources within universities, even if it's just manpower, right? To be able to kind of carry forward some of these community initiatives, make use of those, right? Make the university work for you.
That's a perfect way, I think, for us to bring this conversation to a close. But as all three panelists have said, it's about building relationships that move beyond the one big grand gesture. So we don't want this to be our one big grand gesture. We want it to be a start of those relationships and those conversations about mutually beneficial and reciprocal kinds of projects that Mike's talking about, for example. I do want to go ahead and share this final screen as we kind of make our final comments. So for students, if you're here for BCR credit, this is the link that you can scan. Cameron mentioned that we would share the three other QR codes again at the end, and so here they are. We will gather together some of the kinds of resources, books, podcasts, movies, that sort of thing, and we'll send it out to all of the attendees because you registered for this webinar. We do have your email addresses to be able to send those out. But before we go, I do want to express my gratitude to a number of people. First and foremost, of course, to Mike, to Tyler, to Logan. Thank you so much for taking the time and the energy to join us tonight. As Logan reminds us, you get these requests all the time, hundreds of them, and we just appreciate that you've said yes to us on this evening, and we look forward to continuing to build that relationship. I want to also thank Cameron, my co-moderator, and also he has been a guiding force on this campus for the past couple of years, has started a student group. It is going to be an incredible loss to Butler when he graduates this spring, but hopefully the alumni network will stay strong. I want to thank Alina Ahmad, who is the intern from the Desmond Tutu Peace Lab, who has been working tirelessly on putting this organization or this panel together. To Julie Searcy, who moderated Monday night. Thank you, Julie. And then all the folks behind the scenes, Alexis Newell in the Hub, Tia Van Hester, who directs RGSS, who both of those organizations help financially support this, as well as the Diversity Center. So we also want to thank Randall Ojeda, Brenda Jenkins, Elizabeth Hustleton, also helping to sort of work through contracts, et cetera. I'm horrified that I've missed somebody, but there's just been a lot of folks and a lot of hands. And of course, all the members of the Task Force for Indigenous Inclusion and Engagement who have been working to build the ideas for this work and who will continue it long after Cameron's gone, long after I'm gone. I also leave in the spring. But so thank you all so much. Cameron,